When a person no longer seeks the approval of the narcissist, something profound begins to unfold, something psychologically seismic. This isn't just a surface-level behavioral change where you become a bit more assertive or stop answering their texts immediately. It's an existential shift. It's the kind of transformation that disrupts the entire architecture of a narcissist's ego, because what they fundamentally need, what their entire psychological apparatus is constructed around, is control through admiration, dependency, and validation. Your need for their approval is the fuel for their delusion of superiority and their fantasy of omnipotence. So what happens when that fuel runs dry? What happens when, after perhaps years of being emotionally manipulated, gaslighted, and systematically deconstructed, you wake up, not with bitterness, but with clarity, and you no longer need them to affirm your existence? They collapse, not outwardly, not always dramatically, but internally, quietly, pathetically, because you've done the one thing that renders them powerless. You've remembered who you are without them. You see, the narcissist builds their world on illusion, their image, their identity, even their relationships. None of it is grounded in truth. It's all performative, constructed, held together by fragile threads of control and delusion. And your role in their life was never about love, never about seeing you as a person with intrinsic value. It was about how well you could reflect the fantasy back to them. You were a mirror, not a companion. So long as you mirrored back admiration, compliance, and emotional energy, you were tolerated, even praised. But the moment you begin to see clearly, to move independently, to act out of conviction rather than codependence, you stop being useful. And that's when the games begin, the sabotage, the guilt, the sudden rage, the silent treatment, the crocodile tears. Why? Because your transformation isn't just inconvenient, it's existentially threatening. It's important to understand this. Your healing is not neutral in their world. Your growth is not just your business. In the narcissist's framework, your autonomy is a betrayal, but in reality, it is liberation. What most people fail to grasp, especially those who have never been entangled with a narcissist, is just how deeply psychological dependency becomes wired into these relationships. The narcissist doesn't just want you to love them, they need you to need them. Your lack of clarity, your self-doubt, your confusion, your trauma-bonded guilt, those are the invisible chains they rely on. They feed on the dysfunction, because in a healthy, reciprocal relationship, they would drown. There's no power to grasp at, no inferiority to exploit, no chaos to orchestrate. So when you change, really change, and begin to step outside the script, they panic, not because you're gone, but because the illusion of who they are begins to collapse. And I would argue that this collapse, this ego shattering, is not always visible. That's part of the trap. You might expect a moment, something theatrical, but narcissists are masters of hiding their internal disintegration. They might lash out, they might go quiet, they might move on to someone else. But what you don't see is the spiritual decay that sets in when the person they thought they could control wakes up and walks away. Not with hatred, but with peace. Because that's what truly destroys them. Not vengeance, not loud accusations, not dramatic confrontations, but your quiet, unwavering indifference, your capacity to walk forward. Head held high, grounded in self, knowledge, and dignity, without looking back. That's what shatters them, and ironically, that's also what heals you. Now let's take a step back and examine this more philosophically. What does it mean to no longer seek the approval of someone who never truly saw you? It means you've moved from the external to the internal, from being objectified to being rehumanized. You are no longer an actor in someone else's ego drama. You are the author of your own moral narrative. This is deeply tied to the classical idea of logos, truth spoken, truth lived. When you live according to what is true, not what is comfortable or what keeps the peace, you begin to reorder your psychological structure. You stop betraying yourself. That's the moment the narcissist loses, not when you yell, not when you expose them, but when you quietly stop lying to yourself, and you do it consistently, without ceremony. Without needing them to understand, because they won't, and they don't have to. Their understanding is not a prerequisite for your freedom. The tragedy of narcissism is that it creates a world where love cannot exist, only control. But the tragedy of staying entangled with a narcissist is that you begin to believe that control is love. Breaking free from that lie is one of the most powerful spiritual awakenings a person can undergo. So here's the truth you must remember. You don't need their permission to change. You don't need their blessing to heal. You don't need their approval to walk away. You are allowed to rise without applause. You are allowed to rebuild without announcing it. You are allowed to exist, fully, freely, and without justification. And in that existence, in that quiet strength, lies the silent thunder that shatters the narcissist's ego forever. You win the moment you no longer need them to know that you've won. When you stop reacting emotionally to a narcissist's provocations, when you become composed, anchored, steady, they begin to lose their grip on you and, more significantly, on themselves. This isn't just a social dynamic. It's a psychological dismantling of a power structure that depends entirely on your emotional instability to stay intact. The narcissist doesn't thrive on your love or your loyalty. They thrive on your emotional volatility. Your anger, your confusion, your desperation. Those are the tools they use to sculpt the illusion of superiority. Once you stop feeding them with those responses, they're left with nothing but the hollow sound of their own manipulations echoing in a void. It's essential to understand this mechanism at its core. The narcissist survives by drawing you into a predictable cycle. Provoke, observe your emotional reaction, then use that reaction to reinforce their perceived control. It's never random, it's strategic. Even their silence is strategic. Every insult, every backhanded compliment, every moment of passive, aggressive withdrawal, it's all part of the same game. And the rules are simple. Keep you off balance so they remain elevated. Your emotional response becomes their affirmation that they still matter, that they're still in charge, that their presence still has power. But when you begin to master yourself, when your internal world becomes more ordered, more governed by principle than emotion, something begins to shift. You stop reacting on command. You no longer play the role they've cast you in. And to a narcissist, this is terrifying because it suggests that their power was never real. It only existed in your response. Without your reaction, they're just a person saying things. And without your emotional energy, they're irrelevant. Think about that. It's not about whether you win an argument. It's about whether you even feel compelled to argue. There's a depth of strength in restraint that narcissists cannot comprehend, much less imitate. They mistake emotional outbursts for power, but true power is composure, and the moment you access that, you're no longer operating within their psychological economy. You've exited the system. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean you suppress your feelings. Suppression is a form of self-betrayal, and that's not strength. What I'm talking about is something far more mature and ordered, emotional regulation born of insight. You begin to understand the game, the tactics, the cycle, and in understanding, you create distance. That space gives you perspective, and from that perspective, you gain clarity, and with clarity, you gain authority over yourself. Not over others, over yourself. That's what breaks the narcissist's grip. But there's another layer to this. When you stop reacting, they begin to feel exposed. See, your emotional responses used to act like a smokescreen. As long as you were yelling, crying, defending, or apologizing, no one was looking at them. They could keep playing the victim, the martyr, the misunderstood genius. But when you stop reacting, when you meet their chaos with calm, there's nothing left to distract from their behavior. Their dysfunction stands alone in plain view, and they can't handle that. They cannot survive prolonged exposure to their own truth. So what do? They escalate. They might increase the intensity. They might try to bait you harder. They might pretend to be wounded or confused. But if you hold the line, if you stay rooted in your integrity and continue to act, not react, you strip their manipulations of all effectiveness. The mask begins to crack, not because you tore it off, but because it can no longer hold up under the weight of reality. That's when the collapse begins, not loudly, but internally, and you, on the other hand, begin to rise. Because you're no longer dancing to someone else's tune, You're no longer giving your emotional energy away to someone who weaponizes it against you. You're no longer a puppet pulled by invisible strings of guilt, fear, or hope. You are a person with limits, with clarity, with purpose. The goal is not to dominate the narcissist, that's a distraction. The goal is to become immune to their dysfunction, to become so deeply rooted in your own identity, your own values, that their chaos no longer tempts you. You stop engaging with their world and you start building your own. And that kind of transformation isn't just psychological, it's spiritual, it's redemptive. When you stop reacting, you don't just hurt the narcissist, you reveal them. Not to others necessarily, but to themselves. You hold up a mirror not out of malice, but out of stillness, and what they see they cannot endure. So don't underestimate the power of your calm. Don't dismiss the strength it takes to walk away without shouting, to disengage without justifying, to stay silent not out of fear, but out of wisdom. That is the silence that speaks loudest. That is the absence that echoes longest. And if you ever doubt whether your composure matters, remember this. The narcissist's ego was built on your chaos, but their undoing, that begins with your peace. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a soul that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. When you stop reacting emotionally to a narcissist's provocations, when you become composed, anchored steady, they begin to lose their grip on you and, more significantly, on themselves. This isn't just a social dynamic. It's a psychological dismantling of a power structure that depends entirely on your emotional instability to stay intact. The narcissist doesn't thrive on your love or your loyalty. They thrive on your emotional volatility. Your anger, your confusion, your desperation. Those are the tools they use to sculpt the illusion of superiority. Once you stop feeding them with those responses, they're left with nothing but the hollow sound of their own manipulations echoing in a void. It's essential to understand this mechanism at its core. The narcissist survives by drawing you into a predictable cycle. Provoke, observe your emotional reaction, then use that reaction to reinforce their perceived control. It's never random, it's strategic. Even their silence is strategic. Every insult, every backhanded compliment, every moment of passive, aggressive withdrawal, it's all part of the same game, and the rules are simple. Keep you off balance so they remain elevated. Your emotional response becomes their affirmation that they still matter, that they're still in charge, that their presence still has power. But when you begin to master yourself, when your internal world becomes more ordered, more governed by principle than emotion, something begins to shift. You stop reacting on command. You no longer play the role they've cast you in. And to a narcissist, this is terrifying, because it suggests that their power was never real. It only existed in your response. Without your reaction, they're just a person saying things, and without your emotional energy, they're irrelevant. Think about that. It's not about whether you win an argument. It's about whether you even feel compelled to argue. There's a depth of strength in restraint that narcissists cannot comprehend, much less imitate. They mistake emotional outbursts for power, but true power is composure, and the moment you access that, you're no longer operating within their psychological economy. You've exited the system. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean you suppress your feelings. Suppression is a form of self-betrayal, and that's not strength. What I'm talking about is something far more mature and ordered. Emotional regulation born of insight. You begin to understand the game, the tactics, the cycle, and in understanding you create distance. That space gives you perspective, and from that perspective you gain clarity, and with clarity you gain authority over yourself. Not over others, over yourself. That's what breaks the narcissist's grip, but there's another layer to this. When you stop reacting, they begin to feel exposed. See, your emotional responses used to act like a smokescreen. As long as you were yelling, crying, defending, or apologizing, no one was looking at them. They could keep playing the victim, the martyr, the misunderstood genius, but when you stop reacting, when you meet their chaos with calm, there's nothing left to distract from their behavior. Their dysfunction stands alone in plain view, and they can't handle that. They cannot survive prolonged exposure to their own truth, So what do? They escalate. They might increase the intensity. They might try to bait you harder, they might pretend to be wounded or confused, but if you hold the line, if you stay rooted in your integrity and continue to act, not react, you strip their manipulations of all effectiveness. The mask begins to crack, not because you tore it off, but because it can no longer hold up under the weight of reality. That's when the collapse begins, not loudly, but internally, and you, on the other hand, begin to rise. Because you're no longer dancing to someone else's tune, you're no longer giving your emotional energy away to someone who weaponizes it against you, you're no longer a puppet pulled by invisible strings of guilt, fear, or hope. You are a person with limits, with clarity, with purpose. The goal is not to dominate the narcissist, that's a distraction. The goal is to become immune to their dysfunction, to become so deeply rooted in your own identity, your own values, that their chaos no longer tempts you. You stop engaging with their world and you start building your own, and that kind of transformation isn't just psychological, it's spiritual, it's redemptive. When you stop reacting, you don't just hurt the narcissist, you reveal them. Not to others necessarily, but to themselves. You hold up a mirror, not out of malice, but out of stillness, and what they see, they cannot endure. So don't underestimate the power of your calm. Don't dismiss the strength it takes to walk away without shouting, to disengage without justifying, to stay silent not out of fear, but out of wisdom. That is the silence that speaks loudest. That is the absence that echoes longest. And if you ever doubt whether your composure matters, remember this. The narcissist's ego was built on your chaos, but their undoing, that begins with your peace. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a soul that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. What truly dismantles a narcissist's carefully constructed illusion is not your confrontation, but your elevation. It's your healing. It's your decision, sometimes in silence, to become something greater than the version of yourself they tried to contain. You see, narcissists do not fear your rage. They don't even fear your rejection. What terrifies them to their core is your evolution, your transformation into someone who is no longer psychologically available for their games. And this is a concept that's deeply embedded not just in psychology, but in the entire structure of human development. To evolve beyond someone's manipulation is to place yourself outside their reach. It renders them powerless without ever needing to lift a finger against them. Now, let's think about this through a deeper lens. The narcissist constructs a distorted world, a psychological prison in which they are the warden, the victim, and the hero all at once. They pull others into this narrative using guilt, flattery, fear, and shame. And over time, you begin to live inside their projection of you, not the truth of you, but the version of you that serves their ego. That is where the erosion of the self begins, and it's subtle, it's incremental. You lose your clarity, then your boundaries, then your voice, until one day you don't recognize yourself, but they do. Because that version, that hollow, doubt version, is what they engineered all along. But here's the turning point. When you begin to heal, you begin to remember. You remember that you are not an extension of someone else's insecurity. You remember that you were never created to orbit around another person's emotional needs. And as you heal through therapy, through faith, through knowledge, through struggle, you slowly reclaim every piece of yourself that was surrendered to survive. And with every piece that returns, so does your power. Healing is not passive, it's not soft, it's not merely reflective. It's an act of war against every internalized lie you believed about your worth. And that's why it threatens the narcissist, because they built their entire illusion on the assumption that you'd never wake up, that you'd remain in a state of emotional dependence or confusion, that you'd keep seeking their approval. But healing is the moment when you stop needing their validation to define your reality, and when that happens, they don't just lose control, they lose significance. There's also a metaphysical element to this. When you commit to growth, to truth, to becoming something integrated and principled, you're aligning yourself with what is eternal, with order, with responsibility, and responsibility is where meaning resides. It's the only antidote to the chaos that narcissists attempt to keep you trapped in. You rise not by attacking them, but by refusing to be complicit in their delusion anymore. You rise by building a life of substance, where your value is intrinsic, not performative. And as you begin to thrive quietly, steadily, they see it, maybe from a distance, maybe through mutual acquaintances, maybe just by noticing that their old tactics no longer provoke the same reaction. But they notice, and with that awareness comes fear, not fear of you harming them, because again, they are not afraid of confrontation. They're afraid of irrelevance, and there's nothing more irrelevant to a narcissist than a person they can no longer control. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that it doesn't rely on them changing. You're not waiting for an apology. You're not hoping they'll see the error of their ways. Your healing bypasses them completely. It removes the center of gravity from their manipulation and places it firmly within your own moral and psychological framework. And that shift, that quiet, profound shift, is irreversible, and it doesn't mean you're suddenly invulnerable. Healing doesn't make you immune to pain, but it gives you discernment. You start to recognize patterns quicker. You stop rationalizing abuse. You stop negotiating your boundaries, and you stop participating in relationships where your dignity is a bargaining chip. That's not just emotional maturity, that's sovereignty. So, if you're wondering what shatters a narcissist's ego forever, it's this: your refusal to be defined by the broken lens through which they see the world. Your insistence on becoming whole, your commitment to a path they cannot follow, because that path requires humility and self-confrontation and truth, and those are the very things the narcissist has built their identity to avoid. Your healing is the evidence that their story about you was never the final word. It is the refutation, the counter-narrative, the revelation, and it speaks louder than any revenge, louder than any argument, because it says, you no longer get to write the ending. And so I'll leave you with this: you don't overcome darkness by cursing it. You overcome it by lighting a candle and carrying it forward, step by step, into a future that no longer includes the lie that you were ever powerless. Your healing is your revolution. Let it be complete. Let it be visible, and let it be enough. To understand what truly dismantles the narcissistic ego, you need to grasp something that most people avoid facing: the strength of your silence. Not passive silence, not cowardice masquerading as peace, but deliberate, disciplined, principled silence. That's a very different thing, because silence, when rooted in strength and not fear, speaks a language far more powerful than outrage or retaliation. And it speaks it clearly, to the narcissist most of all. It confronts them with something they cannot dominate, cannot decode, and ultimately cannot endure: your refusal to play their game. Now, this kind of silence is not just the absence of words. It is the presence of discernment. It means choosing not to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. It means withdrawing your energy, your insight, your attention, everything they depend on to feed their fragile self-image. The narcissist thrives on engagement, on reaction, on drama. Their ego is a performance, and they need an audience. When you become unresponsive, not out of apathy, but out of clarity, you effectively end the performance. The curtain falls, the lights go out, and all that remains is a deeply insecure person left to face the hollowness they've tried to mask with control. See, people often think that to assert power, you have to be loud. You have to fight back, confront, accuse, expose, and in some situations that's necessary. But with a narcissist, confrontation often becomes fuel. They twist it, reinterpret it, use it as material for their victim narrative. They are masterful at turning your resistance into another proof of their own righteousness, but silence, principled silence, that doesn't give them anything to work with. It's like psychological starvation. It cuts off the supply that sustains their delusions. There's also a profound moral dimension to this, because silence, when it is conscious and rooted in self-respect, becomes a kind of protest, a refusal to legitimize the chaos they want to entangle you in. It's you saying, I see the trap and I choose not to walk into it, not again. And that's critical, because a narcissist doesn't just want control over your behavior, they want control over your perception of reality. They want you to doubt your memory, your intuition, your worth, They want you so entangled in self-questioning that you lose sight of who you are, and the longer you stay reactive, the longer they maintain that grip. But silence disrupts that. It makes space, space for truth to reemerge, space for your identity to be rebuilt, no longer in reaction to their distortion, but in alignment with what is objectively real. It's like stepping back from a distorted mirror and finally seeing your reflection clearly, not through their projections, but through your own restored vision. Now, let's be clear, this silence isn't about retreating from responsibility. It's not about pretending abuse didn't happen. It's about choosing a higher form of response. It's about saying, I will not wrestle in the mud with someone who enjoys the dirt. I will rise. I will walk away. And I will rebuild my life in a direction they cannot follow, because it requires humility, accountability, and truth. 3 things a narcissist has spent their whole life avoiding. This kind of silence is also deeply spiritual. It reflects something ancient and enduring, the wisdom of restraint. In the book of Proverbs, there's a line, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. That's not just religious poetry. That's psychological insight, because when you learn to be quiet, not in fear but in strength, you start to gain clarity. You begin to see the narcissist not as powerful, but as pitiable. You stop giving them the authority to define you. And in that refusal, you become sovereign. And here's the most devastating part from the narcissist's perspective. They will try everything to pull you back in. They'll provoke, they'll bait, they'll apologize. They'll accuse because your silence unsettles them more than your anger ever did. Your silence reminds them that they are no longer the axis around which your identity revolves, and that is what they cannot tolerate. It's not easy, let's not pretend it is. To hold your peace in the face of manipulation, deceit, and injustice takes immense internal discipline. It takes an anchoring in something deeper than the immediate emotional impulse. It takes a long view, a vision not just of escape, but of transformation. And that's what this really is, not escape, but evolution. You are not just leaving the narcissist behind. You are becoming someone they could never have tolerated in their presence, someone whole, someone grounded, someone beyond their reach, and that journey begins often in silence, not a silence of fear, but of strength. A silence that says, I know who I am, I know what I will and will not allow, and I choose peace, not because I am weak, but because I have finally remembered my strength. So here is what I leave you with. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is no statement at all. Not because you're defeated, but because you're done explaining, done defending, done reacting. You rise in silence, and in doing so, you leave the narcissist to wrestle with the one enemy they've never been able to conquer, themselves. What breaks a narcissist isn't just your boundaries. It's your unapologetic self-possession. It's when you stop orbiting around their chaos and start building your own inner world with order, discipline, and truth. And at the center of that world is a frightening reality for them. You no longer need them. You no longer crave their approval. You no longer seek validation from the very person who once manipulated your sense of worth. That more than any confrontation, more than any argument, is what shatters the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. You see, narcissists operate in a carefully constructed psychological framework. It's parasitic, really. They feed on emotional supply, attention, praise, fear, guilt, even your confusion. They build their identity not on a stable core, but on constant external reinforcement. They exist, in essence, as a reflection of others' reactions. And when you no longer react, when you become grounded in your values, when you live in alignment with your convictions, they are confronted with something they cannot absorb or distort: authenticity. That's the crux of it. You've moved from dependency to dignity, and that is intolerable to someone who thrives on your dependence. The narcissist needs you in a reactive state. They want you emotional, uncertain, and off balance. That's how they maintain dominance. But when you begin to live with clarity, when your yes means yes and your no means no, not because you're afraid or trying to please, but because you are anchored in truth, something seismic begins to shift. You become dangerous, not in the sense of violence or malice, but in the sense that you are no longer easily controlled. Your inner structure has hardened. You've confronted your fear of rejection, your fear of abandonment, and you've survived it. And on the other side, you've emerged as someone capable of bearing the burden of responsibility. That terrifies the narcissist because it reveals just how empty their game really is. There's no one left to perform for them. There's no audience clapping. The lights go down and they're standing alone in the fiction they built. But here's what most people misunderstand. This transformation isn't about becoming cold or bitter. That's not strength. That's unresolved pain. Real strength is warm. It's open, handed but discerning. It's generous but guarded. You learn to love without becoming enslaved by the need to be loved in return. That's what separates emotional maturity from the manipulative patterns narcissists use to entrap others. So what does this look like practically? It means you stop making excuses for their behavior. You stop believing that if you were just more understanding, more forgiving, more flexible, then maybe they'd change. That's the trap. The narcissist thrives on the belief that their victims can rescue them. But transformation doesn't come through appeasement, it comes through consequence, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to walk away, not out of hatred, not even out of anger, but out of clarity. Because staying in the relationship only enables the dysfunction, and here's the truth people often don't want to hear, you can forgive someone and still never speak to them again. Forgiveness is a moral decision. Reconciliation requires repentance, and narcissists rarely repent. They perform apologies when it benefits them, but repentance, that requires humility, and humility is death to the false self they've spent a lifetime constructing. When you embrace your individuality, when you develop your intellect, your emotional life, your moral clarity, you're not just becoming independent, you're becoming integrated, and that's crucial. You're no longer fragmented. You're no longer pulled in 1,000 directions by the needs and manipulations of someone who wants to blur the lines of your identity. You are whole, and wholeness cannot be controlled. Now, that doesn't mean you won't feel pain. Let's not romanticize this. Breaking free from a narcissist, especially if it's someone close, family, a partner, a mentor, is deeply painful. It can feel like death. In some ways, it is a kind of death, the death of a false self you had to create in order to survive. But on the other side is resurrection, and that's not poetic hyperbole. That's the psychological and spiritual process of transformation. You die to the illusion, and you rise in truth. And the narcissist, they're left with a reflection they no longer recognize, not because you've become cruel or vindictive, but because you've become real. That's what they can't endure, the reality of a person who has healed, who has integrated, who no longer dances around their brokenness trying to fix them, who stands calm, grounded, and unreachable, not because they're above others, but because they're finally rooted in truth. So the real question becomes, who are you when you no longer need them? Who are you when the fog of manipulation lifts and you begin to see clearly? That's where your power lies, and that's what terrifies them most. Not your rage, not your words, not even your absence, but your wholeness. Let me leave you with this. When you stop needing the narcissist, you don't just break free. You reveal the truth. And once truth enters the room, the illusion shatters. Every time, there is a profound and unsettling moment when a narcissist encounters a person who refuses to be manipulated, who refuses to surrender their integrity, who refuses to respond with fear, anger, or confusion. This moment is less about confrontation and more about a silent declaration. You are no longer their source of power. You are no longer an emotional hostage. In fact, you have become the very antithesis of what they need to sustain their grandiose self-image. This refusal, this calm and unwavering self-possession, is what truly shatters a narcissist's ego forever. It is crucial to understand why this happens. Narcissists live in a world built on projection and illusion. Their sense of self is fragile, dependent on a constant supply of external validation. They construct their identity like a house of cards. Each compliment, each reaction, Each sign of admiration is a card carefully placed to prop up a structure that cannot stand on its own. Their ego is not grounded in authentic selfhood. It is a fragile veneer, desperately maintained. When you stop participating in the game, when you stop giving them the emotional responses they crave, you remove the very foundation on which their ego rests. This is not simply about saying no or setting boundaries, although those are important steps. It goes deeper. It is about cultivating an internal fortress of self-awareness, self-respect, and emotional resilience so strong that the narcissist's attempts at control simply bounce off. You have become impermeable to their tactics, and this impenetrability is the fatal blow. Consider this from a psychological standpoint. The narcissist's attempts to dominate and control are rooted in insecurity and fear. They need others to feel powerful, but this power is borrowed and conditional. It exists only insofar as others submit to their demands and projections. When you cease to be that mirror reflecting their grandiosity, they face a terrifying void. This void threatens to collapse the false self they have meticulously constructed. The more you embody your own truth, the more their constructed reality crumbles. But it is not merely about withdrawal or silence as a passive defense. True self-possession is an active force. It involves knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to allow anyone to diminish that. It is a conscious and courageous act to stand firm in your convictions, to hold your ground emotionally and morally, especially in the face of someone trained to provoke, destabilize, and confuse. This form of silent strength is disarming. The narcissist, accustomed to chaos and submission, finds themselves confronting something unfamiliar. A person who does not react with predictable fear or rage, but responds with composed dignity. This breaks the cycle. It leaves them speechless because their usual tools, gaslighting, blame-shifting, rage, fail to elicit the desired reaction. Their frustration grows as they realize the game has changed and they are losing control. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper truth about power and autonomy. True power is not the ability to dominate others, but the ability to govern oneself. When you master yourself, you deny the narcissist the very thing they need most: control over your inner world. This mastery is not achieved overnight. It is the result of a disciplined process of self-examination, healing, and growth. It requires confronting painful truths, acknowledging your vulnerabilities, and choosing to rise above them. In this process, you reclaim your narrative. Narcissists thrive on rewriting your story to fit their needs, to paint themselves as victims or heroes while casting you as flawed or dependent. When you live authentically and refuse to be complicit in this distortion, you reclaim your identity and narrative. This reclamation is an act of liberation. It cuts through the tangled web of manipulation and deception. The power of silent revenge lies in this reclamation. It is not about retaliation or revenge in the conventional sense. It is a profound inner victory, a victory so complete that it leaves no room for the narcissist's projections to take hold. You win not by confrontation, but by transformation. You win by becoming whole, by becoming true to yourself. There is a certain dignity in this victory that words cannot capture. It transcends the petty struggles of ego and enters the realm of moral and psychological sovereignty. It is the ultimate defeat of the narcissist's game, because it removes the prize they sought to claim. But here is the most important point. This transformation is not just for the sake of defeating the narcissist. It is for your own sake, your peace, your freedom, your life. When you refuse to be defined by the narcissist's narrative, you open the door to genuine healing and growth. You create space to cultivate relationships based on mutual respect and truth rather than manipulation and control. So, when you find yourself face to face with the chaos of narcissistic abuse, remember this. The most potent weapon you have is your refusal to be controlled. Your silence, grounded in strength and clarity, can speak louder than any argument or confrontation. It is the silence that says, "I am no longer your captive. I am whole. I am free." To live this truth requires courage and faith in yourself, and for many, in something greater than yourself. It requires patience, for transformation is a journey, not a moment. But every step away from their control is a step toward your sovereignty. Let this be the legacy you leave for yourself. a life marked not by bitterness or vengeance, but by the quiet power of integrity and resilience. When you embrace this, you do not just silence the narcissist, you silence the chaos within yourself, and in that silence you find peace. Remember, the cost of your freedom is your commitment to your own truth. The reward is immeasurable, a life lived on your own terms, unshaken by the manipulations of others. This is the victory that shatters a narcissist's ego forever, and it is a victory available to all who choose it.